Morning, fellow compatriots. In explaining Africa's challenge with mineral wealth, it is useful to perhaps explain a statement by Kwame Nkrumah that is often caricatured. Kwame Nkrumah, in his first address on the 25th of May 1963, to the inaugural summit of the Organization of African Union or Unity, the OAU, he said, amongst other things, we are often told that we are poor, but our gold bullion is in Fort Nixon in the United States, and it nourishes the economies of the imperial centers. Then he, in explaining what Africa needed to do, said, seek ye first the political kingdom. He was talking about African unification. Nkrumah had, in almost near political, social, prophetic insight, seen that the gateway to extractivism or the ability of external countries or powers to exploit Africa lay in three things. Number one, that Africa did not and had never had the capacity or ability to determine the extent of natural wealth under its soil. That's GeoSurvey data. Number two, Africa had no way of valuing and determining the price of such natural resource wealth, and therefore it was always determined by those who wished to extract it and use it for their own benefit. Number three, Nkrumah appreciated that Africa had no capacity or had not invested sufficiently in the capacity to beneficiate the natural resource wealth. So we were producing gold, manganese, copper, and every other mineral, aluminium from bauxite, and etc., diamonds for industrial machines and for the aesthetic value of the Westerners. But we ourselves were not industrializing. We were not creating the jobs that were required. So we were not using these minerals. We were sending raw materials outside, and that's why Nkrumah refers to Fort Knox in the UK, in the United States. So Nkrumah, in essence, realized that the divide and rule or divide and conquer politics of the imperial centers and of the global north, and now we see some from the Middle East and the East, was designed to sustain instability that would enable them to extract at minimum value our natural resources. This is the tragedy we see in Mozambique, and today we are talking about Zambia. Such that the price of the raw material is determined by the global market. The value of the extracted raw material is determined by the extractor. The nature and extent of the raw material is only known by the extractor, and that the African is unable or is unwilling or has not put in place a technology and other means to get to know this. So in essence, Nkrumah's idea was, given the size of our states that we had inherited from colonialism, it was essential to build economies of scale, that is, to integrate politically so that we had a fighting chance against these militarily more superior, technologically more advanced states in the West. And so he said, seek first that political kingdom, the ability to govern yourself internally, to build coherence of state, stability of state, and he realized that little states coming against these mighty imperial powers would not be able to sustain themselves, either because of the race to the bottom, that countries are all in this political beauty pageantry to try and please the West, or there would be a challenge that I have already adverted to of being divided. So the solution to Africa's mineral resource challenge lies in the Nkrumah dream. Number one, let's build the technological and scientific capacity to assess what we have under our soil. And let's build the economic know-how to determine the value and build the regional and other value chains to determine the beneficiation and value addition that would enable us to create for ourselves jobs, for our citizens value. But let's also integrate into that the accountability that would enable us to develop as a common, develop as nations, not just this extraction that benefits families and cartels and mafioso within our economies. The other solution that Nkrumah suggested is without a common platform, a common negotiating platform. That's why China calls the entire 55 African countries to Beijing, China, Africa, one country discussing with Africa. It's because unless we have a common and collective position on these, we will be easy pickings. I wish to refer you all to you will find it on the internet, which is the first resolution of the OAU on the 25th of May, 1963. It refers to the 5 imperatives that Africa had to undergo in order, in the perception of those states that were independent in 1963, had to undergo. There were 7, but I'll focus on the 5. The first and foremost was the democratization of the United Nations to ensure that there is greater representation of African states, and in particular addressing the question of the Security Council Permanent 5 question, which is a position which had solidified soon after the Second World War, that actually does not reflect the current geo-economic and geopolitical reality. I also want to refer you to the second resolution, which is how Africans dealt with the issue of apartheid in South Africa. And that resolution, they formed the Africa Liberation Committee, which was to be based in Dar es Salaam. The third related resolution was how Africa, at the time, intended to deal with the social crisis, including human development, capacity development, asset development, human asset development, capability development, the social agenda. They looked at the possibilities of developing a Pan-African university, possibilities of developing centers of excellence that will teach vocational training, agriculture, and etc. And related to that was the idea of what to do with African youth. And the fourth resolution had to do with economy, which was economic integration, transformation of, if you like, decoupling African currencies from the European, talking about the CFI in the La Francophonie countries. And then, of course, there was the issue of narrative, Pan-African media, and etc. That resolution will give you a lot more than what I have said. This is necessary because the question of African representation must be appreciated not as a mere question of physical presence of Africans within the global multilateral system, and in particular the United Nations Security Council, which deals with matters of security, peace and security, but within the WTO, which deals with matters of trade, within other permanent, within representation within the Bretton Woods institutions, whether it's through the question of SDRs and etc. We see that until we democratize global economy, global governance, and global security, what will continue to happen is that primordial, colonial, imperial security and economic agenda will dominate what happens elsewhere in the world. The counter to that would have been to build the South Global or South-South platforms. In the early years, post-Bandung conference, Southern countries came together in the non-aligned movement, which at that time had been convened by Malaysia and India. And within that, they sought to articulate a radical alternative view or version of the world that did not depend on alignment to the Soviet bloc or the NATO, Warsaw or NATO Pact. The challenge we face within the current United Nations system, it's a multilateral system that in fairness is dominated by interest of those that fund the United Nations. If you look at senior personnel of the United Nations, and granted the Guterres as the current Secretary General has gone to a great extent to try and reform that. Before the Guterres moment, you saw even within Africa, the majority of the most senior ranking UN officials were from Nordic countries, European countries, or those countries that finance the United Nations. So power, even within the decentralized structures, tend to be dominated by Europeans and Americans, and not by Africans or Asians. So before you get to the Security Council, you see within the UN structure the domination of decision-making by those who fund it. And you will then come to the African Union, because I'm making this point in order to say the democratization of the UN Security Council must be seen as part of a total package of the democratization and reconstitution of multilateralism in its full expression. So if you then come to the African Union, until recently, the African Union's operational as well as, if you like, a programmatic budget was over 90% funded by donors. So donors tended to determine a lot, if not through political pressure, they did so through technical deployment. It seems that the challenge we face is not one of absence at the top. It's even absence within our own backyards. And the recent scandal about Israel's observer status within the African Union typifies the sort of contradictions that you see in how Africa ideologically, politically, and economically engages with the rest of the world, and the bifurcation between strategic national self-interest and the collective continental interest. Africa's population will have three characteristics. The first, 60% of the population, which is young, will by 2050 not only be the majority. For most of our countries presently, actually, over 70% of the population is under the age of 40. The second component linked to demography is urbanization. The United Nations, the UN Habitat, estimates that 75% of the global population and over 70% of Africa's population will, by the year 2030, live in urban areas, and that 75% will by 2050 live in urban areas. But the nature of urbanization is rapid and chaotic. The nature of economic transformation is still following the old model. And what is that old model? The old model is based on ageism, but the old model is based on an underinvestment in the development of skills. There was a realization, as I already said, that what Africa needed to do was a triple approach to the challenge of industrialization. I have already adverted to the question of what to do with beneficiation and local procurement related issues that would build jobs. If you look at any of our African countries or look at them collectively, so the African billionaires and other world billionaires, Gates, Masiwa, and so on and so forth, indicate that agriculture is going to be the new oil by 2050. So clearly, and we've always known that agriculture was important. And by agriculture, we're talking about the entire value chain, primary production, processing, agro-based industries, agro-marketing, and etc. We also know for certain that extractive industries have been a key source of our economic growth in those countries that have oil, that have diamonds, and etc. We know, too, for a fact that because of our endowment with phenomenal topography, scenic places, whether it's waterfalls or mountains, that tourism is key. But because we have a youthful population that's techno-savvy, we know that technology and the digital opportunities, whether it's digitech or other forms, biotech, is going to be fairly key. And so it's always been important for us to consider how to pivot our educational systems as well as our skills development systems and opportunities. There are several ways of doing this. There may not be sufficient resources within our public coffers. Well, I accept that the resources could be enough. There's not enough to meet our greed, but there is enough to meet our every need. So if people stop buying Bugattis and Lamborghinis from public funds and actually invested them in transformative things, maybe there could be enough. But let's assume, for purposes of the argument, that there's enough within the public coffers, is that the investment contracts we enter into with foreign direct investors should have a significant local procurement and a significant skills development component to it, which means it's not just the old social impact that was conceptualized as building Blair toilets, 1 or 2 school blocks, but it's a revolutionary investment in tertiary education for girls, tertiary education for our young people, micro-enterprise development in the rural areas that are adjacent to the mining areas, so that we begin a revolution that actually says micro-enterprise development within the rural sector as part of industrialization and beneficiation in agriculture, within the mineral sector, and in other sector is key. So I'm suggesting a revolution in education first, a revolution in skills development, related to the education component, and a deployment system that seeks to attract. We have a lot of skills that are in the region that are Zimbabwean. We have other skills that are not Zimbabweans but are African, that are very much needed in the development of our countries. We have diasporans that are very much needed. Right now, for most of our minerals development contracting, whether you are developing actually the contracts or you are doing the work, it's serviced by foreigners. Yet we have, for the same jobs, a lot of Africans. So I'm referring to the term foreigners. I'm using the term foreigners to refer to non-Africans and non-Afro descendants. We have not mapped, we have not created a database that enables us to ask what sort of African skills and competences we have in some of these critical sectors. We have also not created a pathway for young people to be able to earn money. And I've talked about the industrial pathway that looks at the value. There is a myth in certain circles that all we need is STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now that's idiotic. The wealthiest black folk that we know globally, other than Dangote, whether you're talking about Jay-Z, Beyonce, and etc., are people who are involved in arts and culture. We have a huge amount of talent within arts and culture that is globally could be made globally competitive, except here is the tragedy. We've actually never built an industry that is well regulated, that remunerates young people well in the arts and culture space. We have not built the infrastructure for young people who are that way inclined and talented to become, if you like, entrepreneurs and business people who could benefit from that kind of, from the arts and culture, from the artistic talents. It's an industry that earns South Africa more than 25 billion. It's now 40 billion per annum. So if you look even within South Africa, in Zambia and elsewhere, that amount is either controlled by shadowy pirates or by clever white folk who come into the countries and build what are fairly exploitative record-making, art selling, art dealing, or festival hosting entities. So the money, the value that's paid to the black artists, whether they are musicians, sculptors, dancers, and so on, is minuscule. It keeps them in poverty, but it gives them fame. I want to suggest that we need to consider this pathway. The third pathway is the environment. Ecotourism, recycling, and related, and solar, because I think that we need energy in order to industrialize. Young people could easily get into these sectors. We have to create pathways. We have to create funds instead of this trying to create get-rich-quick group of young people. Lastly, it's financial services. I think that cryptocurrency, whatever our apprehension about it is that as long as it creates an opportunity, given the levels of our literacy, it is possible for young people in SADC to benefit from the continental market, also to benefit from the global market, creating financial centers within our countries here, coming together, and lastly, helping young people to create the infrastructure that the region needs by giving them short contracts that would, instead of just wholesale giving these contracts to Chinese, to Italians, and to Americans and British. I think our concern is really, if you think about the debate of whether Western democracy works and whether there's an alternative called African democracy, you might get into a false narrative. We do not currently have, because of the penetration of the digital age, any citizens who are not influenced by the access to global information, access to pop culture, and etc. We also, in this, therefore need to realize that what we call democracy or democratic culture is first and foremost an expression of how a people, a state, a collective models its humanity, designs processes and systems of governance that takes advantage of consensus and consent of those that are governed, ensures effective participation and productive participation, and that for that participation to be of any use, it must be informed. For a system that enables a certain level of diversity, that diversity therefore critical to representation and to ensuring that the leadership is accountable in terms of its service delivery, but is also accountable in terms of the type of policies and agreements it enters into with the external world, so that the leadership is seen as truly stewards of the collective wealth, collective interest of those that live within the nation state. And lastly, that we have systems and institutions, as well as the leadership and policies that enable us to be future fit, to be competitive, and to protect those things that matter to us. And it seems to me that this is not resolved purely by looking at regime typology. Are you a democratic regime? Are you not a democratic regime? It is resolved by looking at the structure of society and the political habits within society. It is resolved by looking at institutions in society, their performative value, how those institutions are expected to perform. That will be linked to how they are staffed. The question I talked about, merit, equity, representation. It is wholly possible to design a system where the state is able to deliver, where citizens are able to effectively participate at all levels, and not limited to simply whether this state passes the Western litmus test of a democracy. Let me explain. We should have our intellectuals, our business folk, our workers, the peasantry, and so on and so forth, sit and first define what is the collective sense of who we are, our identity, what is the collective sense of values that bind us all, and how do we achieve a more equitable society without restraining entrepreneurship or the capacity of people to accumulate wealth, because you cannot distribute what you've not accumulated. So it is not an anti-business approach, it's an anti-exploitation approach. Therefore, that we should not be thinking of democracy purely in political terms. We should be thinking of democracy in environmental, in social, in political, in economic terms. An indivisible approach to democracy, to questions of participation, of inclusion, of access, of ownership, essentially creates a healthy society where none are too poor to be able to have a voice, or none are too rich that they concentrate all power and wealth and therefore are not accountable and operate with impunity. The equilibrium we create in society is an equilibrium of value, an equilibrium of space that enables people to express themselves. So I'd say what we are searching for is egalitarian society. It may be, if you like, a fantasia of sorts, but you get to liberation, you get to a democratic, not democracy necessarily, a democratic state where power is exercised responsibly and accountably, where citizenship is exercised responsibly and accountably if you build the value base and if you build the cultures of consent and consensus. This may mean reimagining most of the things we do, reimagining how we do family, how we do church, reimagining how we do political parties and how we do business. Authoritarianism that we see in politics in most of our countries is the same authoritarianism that you see in the religious space, unquestionable, unaccountable, abusive man of God or woman of God. You see in our companies, infallible boss, tin pot dictator. You see it in our civil society. You cannot have a form of power within politics that's different from how society projects power. Society projects relationships between those who have, who do not have, who are younger and who are older. So democratization is transforming the deeply embedded social pathologies in our society that are intolerant, that are repressive, that are oppressive, that see diversity as enmity as opposed to a source of peculiar and integrated development. Zambia is framed in terms that are sometimes extreme. You have Zambia phobia, those who fear whatever happens in Zambia, and therefore it frames their foreign relations and domestic policy. Then you have Zambia mania, those who see what happens in Zambia as an indicator of what will happen everywhere, as the universal omen of a new day. The two extreme views perhaps may exhibit an unfortunate inability to critically analyze underlying phenomenon. When in October 1991, Zambia became the first English-speaking country in Africa to shed the one-party state. Kaunda had been in power in a one-party state system for 19 years. And usher in what was called the movement for multi-party democracy by Chiluba. Many said finally the winds of change have come to English-speaking Africa. It was barely 3 years later, Edward Chanda, writing in the Zambian Law Review, began to review the performance of the Chiluba MMD regime and noted that it was everything else but democratic. Referred to the deepening of corruption, deepening of lawfare, the use of law to fight opponents. You'll recall that it was the MMD regime that sought to categorize Kaunda as a non-national and did all sorts of vile things, actually. And the MMD regime took power, its repurposing of the state and corruption to new levels. And so Edward Chanda, writing in the Zambia Law Review, notes how, from a human rights perspective, the MMD regime had degenerated, even what they thought was a bad state under Kaunda: intolerance, cannibalization of the state, criminalization of opposition, and etc. This lesson from the Chiluba moment was then used by liberation movements within the region, the Zambia phobics, to thwart any form of labor-based opposition political movements, including in Zimbabwe, the movement for democratic change, because you could easily say to the rest of the region, look at how Chiluba capitulated to the international financial institutions, IMF and World Bank, privatized critical national assets at Song, embraced neoliberalism as a religion, and laid Zambia bare to the vagaries of international capital, and hence the debt trap that Zambia got into. There will be arguments for and against the privatization. We can have those arguments later. But what is indisputable is that Zambia was in a worse off state at the end of the Chiluba moment. The political elite was a lot more corrupt, and overtly so. And when Chiluba was asked a few years into power how he felt, he said he never knew that power was so sweet. Chiluba died a man being tried for corruption. A man who came to power fighting corruption died being tried for corruption, which was carrying bag or trunk loads of cash into the Bahamas, worth more than $5 million. Unbelievable, but it is true. Then, of course, Zambia had its moment, and we must always learn from Zambia. We forget that it had Levi Mwanawasa, it has also had Pierre Banda, it had Michael Sata, it had Edgar Lungu, who himself came as a replacement after a temporary moment when the vice president of Zambia was in charge. And we have this moment, the Hachilema moment. The lesson we learn from Zambia is simple: that power in the hands of any human being or institution is to be restrained by norms that are agreed to by vigilance of the citizenry and of civil society. That power in the hands of any person, especially during a moment of transition, can potentially be used to settle old scores. But power in the hands of a well-intentioned person could be used to recreate national trust, to recreate civic trust, to recreate the sort of expectations that citizens had. So that the Zambian movement should not be appreciated purely in whether or not the opposition won an election, but in whether or not the Zambian majority or citizens have won an opportunity to recreate the balance of forces within their politics and the economy. And what are those balance of forces? Where an elite does not dominate what happens in a country, where economic benefit is distributed, where economic decision making is not opaque, unaccountable, where relations with external actors, whether they are Western, Middle Eastern, or Eastern, are subject to democratic control and oversight, so that no one signs contracts that literally mortgage futures of unborn Zambians. So what we are seeing as the new president comes into power is essentially the opportunity to redress the contractual agreements with all actors within the Zambian extractive sector, but to do what I said in the earlier conversations, which is to create for Zambians new platforms to deepen infrastructure such as education, such as healthcare, to deepen opportunities for all Zambians. But Zambia has had a unique challenge within ethno-regional politics since the time of Kaunda. Part of the reason why Chiluba became very popular was this demand that the governance of the country should reflect a more equitable balance of the different ethno-regional clusters within Zambia. So Hichilema has an opportunity to address that, as well as to address abuses of state power. But this must be done delicately, keeping in mind that it is not so much cleaning the past that will take Zambia into the future. It is imagining that future. And that process of imagining the future has to be a collective enterprise. Hichilema must avoid the temptation that many on the continent have of being a totally victorious person that wins in such absoluteness that they seek to vanquish, to silence their former opponents. Otherwise, he risks creating a new coalition or trade union of the discontented, and his own rule will be fraught with the sort of contradictions that his predecessors' rule or governance had. So I think Zambia offers an opportunity. To understand those opportunities, we must decamp or vacate the extremities of Zambia mania or Zambia phobia. What happened in Zambia is unique to the history of that country, its ability to change leadership peacefully, and it's not the first time a ruling party or governing party has been defeated in Zambia. It's almost the third time. And so we need to look at what it is that makes it possible. And I think that there are many unique reasons. I'll be quick. The pillars of economic transformation are first the development of partly entrepreneurial and technocratic states. We've developed hyper-political states where hyper-incompetent people, whether they are lawyers, political scientists, or any other professionals, dominate a national conversation about governance and about development. We have therefore silenced the rule of evidence and of science, under the guise that obviously that science and evidence alone will not deliver politically optimum outcomes. But we've gone to the other extremes, that in the search for politically optimum outcomes, we have selected people who are neither political nor ideological, nor even sufficiently innovative and future-focused. This is not purely an outcome of those who are courageous or not courageous. It is part of our obsession with electing people from our village, from our regions. It is how we have imbibed the colonial divide and rule logic, which was keep them tribalized so that they are not able to see capacities, they are not able to see representation beyond their tribal enclaves. And within their tribe, split them according to clan and some other non-productive, non-economic vector and factor. So it would seem to me that the first pillar is that the state needs to be reimagined and repurposed. We cannot go into the age of artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial and the fifth industrial revolution, with folks who are still struggling with understanding basic technology and the nuances of how a virtual world functions. Folks who are still obsessing over the ability to repress, to keep surveillance over citizens, over businesses, over opponents, and to primitively accumulate wealth without actually determining how do you value add to your wealth. So the first is the entrepreneurial state. The second is to create a truly business sector. What we have in most of our countries is essentially political party activist cum criminals who, because of access to power, have converted themselves into some form of pseudo business folk. They apply no real business interest. And granted, there are many entrepreneurs, capable entrepreneurs within our countries. But by and large, what we see is thriving by virtue of political mortgage, political exposure, or connectedness. So we have displaced entrepreneurs. We have displaced business folk. So it is to create within our society a consciousness that business does not have to be extractive, exploitative, and externally focused only. And so that's the second pillar. Develop if you like, the culture of doing business, not get-rich-quick schemes, the culture of doing business and rewarding entrepreneurship. The third pillar is research and development. We are never going to develop by copycatting, cut and paste. Every country that's ever industrialized had any meaningful effect on its own economy been transformative has heavily invested in research and development. Our country should be investing heavily in research and development in the tobacco sector because we export tobacco, livestock, and all the other sectors, minerals and alloys, and etc. So apart from dealing with the ownership structure, deal with the knowledge structure, because knowledge imperialism is what keeps you mortgaged to external expertise. You are unable to see the value of the thousands of metallurgy, electrical engineering, ITC, and other graduates that you're producing. So I would say that let's address that third pillar. The fourth pillar, deal with accountability. Economic structural transformation is about developing the right policies for the right moment, getting the right people to do the right job at the right places. If we are not able to do this, then it's pointless. We will have universities training people that can be of value to our economic development, governments employing people who have absolutely no know-how of the sectors because we're using nepotism and other approaches, and those who have the expertise end up employed by external entities or being displaced, going elsewhere in search of greener pastures. So we invest every year, we invest over decades heavily in training expertise that are used elsewhere because we are not governing ourselves accountably so that we're able to absorb our own expertise. We don't value expertise. We over-politicize things that must be kept as technical. And so we frustrate some of the best expertise that we have. So I think those are the first four pillars. The rest we can, once you have R&D, you have the skills and so on. So the rest is getting the right leadership. So the leadership need not be that economically savvy. They just need to have common sense. You know, the first generation of assassinations under the Cold War were assassination of those Africans who dared to see the possibilities. Those Africans who refused the stereotype of natives being incapable of knowledge, being incapable of civility, being incapable of order, being incapable of development. And therefore, those natives, those Africans who refused the tag that there existed almost a divine burden on the white man to civilize, to rule, to govern, to exploit the native. Hegel, before Karl Marx, once said, the native is in everything an infant except in vice. This in European scholarship, racist, white supremacist notion, this caricature that we were wild, animalistic, impish, was constructed in particular to deny the contribution of our ancestors to civilization, to science, to maths, to technology. It was designed to deny how Africa had very organized nation states and empires, and complex writing and other skills, Timbuktu and etc. So basically, it was to disembowel Africans of history so that, as Ngugi says, our past is seen as a wasteland of non-achievement. It's a desert with nothing, no achievement worth emulating. And then this is scholarship in the West that was also designed to persuade the African of his inferiority and the superiority of the white man, so that you were not sufficiently humane if what you understood was faith from the premise of your culture. You were not sufficiently humane if what you understood is production, how people engaged in agriculture, except you worked in the Prazero system and in the white man's farm and mines. So basically, they came to people who were food self-sufficient, imposed a hard tax, a poll tax, and used military force, force of the gun, to force those people to work on the white man's farms. Disemboweled of history, of culture, disemboweled of productive agencies, except when you are serving the needs of the white masters. You had to create amongst the native elite, the ones that you saw as intelligent, an aspiration to be white. So they created opportunities for a few to go and get educated in the West. And as Frantz Fanon notes, when these returned, their kinsfolk realized that their sons and daughters who had gone to Europe and to America had not returned. What had returned were mere shells, echoes of the empire, model missionaries and model mercenaries of white supremacy. They did not believe that anything good could come out of blackness. So these black folk saw their burden as civilizing their own people, as purging their own people of blackness and creating a pseudo whiteness, coconutism. I say this because what fundamentally we were dealing with, what was assassinated, was not the body of Sankara, it was not the body of Lumumba. What was Kud was not Nkrumah. It was the ideas of self-reliance. It was the ideas of unity across ethnic groups. It was the ideas of indivisible nations that could stand up for their own. What was being punished was that these Africans dared to believe in themselves. To this day, we have seen Africans assassinated by other Africans, by their kith and kin, because they dared have self-belief and self-confidence and the genuineness to want to do something for their people and not just for themselves. The Westerners were scared when they first came into our cultures that were communalistic, that believed in collective self-development and self-reliance. And they wanted to teach us individualism, not for us to become successful capitalists. Otherwise, if that had been the intention, surely, for the 200, 300 years they've been here, we would have had plenty African billionaires. It was to create a poverty mentality, a goldfish in a pond mentality amongst the few African elites, so that when we gather, we all can boast about who has a degree from Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard. But none of us are investing, as I said a few days ago, in building Kutama, rebuilding Fletcher, rebuilding Bonda, rebuilding Mzingwane, and so on and so forth. That we would rather let our own institutions dilapidate as long as we carry the badge of honor of having gone to an imperial school somewhere. And we speak with the right accent, we have the right associations. So the distinction, the distinctiveness of our intelligence is no longer measured by what we contribute in the self-development and self-reliance amongst our people and our countries, but in our relationship to an imperial center and how we are acceptable, considered, and knighted by those imperial centers. Let me end by saying that to rebuild a self-belief and self-confidence, it's not just a theory and a regurgitation of the heroic contributions of Samora Moises Machel, of Sankara, of Lumumba, of the Mau Mau, of Neanda, of Kaguvi, Chaminuka, Wata, Paspamire, no. To rebuild self-confidence and self-belief in this day and age is putting in the hands of every child on the continent the technological means and know-how, so that in the fourth industrial revolution, we don't subject them to what our ancestors were subjected to. When the white men arrived on our shores with the Maxim guns, we had assegais. When they started shooting our medicine men and told our people we could drink water and protect ourselves from the Maxim gun. We were not colonized because we were culturally inferior. We were not colonized because we were less intelligent. We were colonized because those who came to take our lands, they were few. Those who came to extract our minerals, they were fewer than us, but they had mightier technology. And they were united even in their different nationalities, and we were divided. Because we were divided and we had inferior technology, we were easy to conquer and to exploit. We are in a historical moment now where we face the same challenge, one of constructed division or divisionism, and one where our leadership does not recognize and realize the imperative of moving our countries into the fourth industrial age and also towards the fifth. Until we ratchet up the ability of children studying sciences and those studying arts, those studying humanities, and we put in their hands the means, the technological means, to be competitive globally, we are subjecting them to the same disequilibrium of power that our ancestors were subjected to. That they will be divided professionally, they will be divided by ethnicity, divided by class, divided by religion even, but they'll be technologically backward. And therefore, they'll be subjected to and conquered by those who have greater technological know-how. So it seems to me that what must be an obsession for all of us is to understand how our history and the heroism and the heroic acts of Sankara, of Patrice Lumumba, should not just be in the resistance that leads to death, but it should also be in the innovation that leads to strength. And that is the new challenge of Pan-Africanism for Zambia, for Zimbabwe, for Nigeria, for Kenya, for as long as we are not focused on the imperative to ensure that those who are on social media are using social media platforms that we develop on the continent. We're investing in researching on the continent. Those who are using applications are using apps that are developed on the continent. Then what will happen is every application, every platform that's technological that we use, its intellectual property rights will be earned elsewhere. Right now, just for those of you who study tax, you will know that we have Amazon here, but Amazon is not taxed in our country. But our people are using Amazon. So the taxing rights of our countries is diminished the more we are using digital platform. Why? We haven't developed our own and the ability to tax the virtual platforms. That's the same for Uber, that Uber can be thriving in the countries that it is thriving, but it is not necessarily generating, other than salaries for the drivers, and sometimes they're poorly paid, any real economic benefit. The bigger benefit is going to the owners of Uber who sit elsewhere. That's the same for Zoom and for other platforms. So economic independence, political independence has to be tagged along with environmental and technological independence. This will not happen if we continue to think of leadership, continue to think of politics and of policy the way we used to. I thank you for the opportunity to share these views. I hope in many words I've been able to say to you that what happened in Zambia is like opening curtains. To open a curtain is not the same as to open a door, to open a window. The challenge of the Zambian leadership is to open the doors and the window so that they can let their citizens into a future that is shared, that's co-created, that's innovative. And for those sitting in Zimbabwe and elsewhere, sometimes we spend a lot of time focusing on politics and how to change leaders politically. We forget to invest in how to change the mindsets of our own followers in civil society, in churches, our own followers in political parties and social groups. And that is why I think our dialogue must not reduce itself into the political beauty pageantry that I talked about, whether we prefer one political leader to the other, whether the one is clearer than the other. But the grand vision that says, how can we bring back onto the bus, into the room, our scientists, our research and development? How can we bring industrialization that's driven by our own people? How can we bring value addition? At the moment, all the governments of SADC have adopted these policies, but the policies are not being implemented. So implementation capacity requires skills. How can we bring those skills? But skills need to be transferred across generations. What are those intergenerational platforms that enable us to become winners together and not just this old Zimbabwean obsession with individual brilliance? I thank you. I hope that as you reflect on these thoughts over the weekend, you'll remember that we've spent a lot of time in arguments about this and that. If we only implemented 10% of what we are arguing about and just remembered that there are no enemies, they are simply citizens who share a common border, who must make a decision to live together as one nation and to benefit from that nation and to develop that nation as a collective. And that politics is supposed to enable us to do that. If politics is a hindrance, then we have to consider other means. The Zimbabwean primitive accumulation that we are seeing in the extractive sector, led by those who are in charge of the state, I think that we often only see the Chinese. I am a great believer. I've been to Beijing. I've had dialogue with people there on policy issues, on what is of benefit to Africa. I get the sense that what we must establish is a people-to-people linkage, the people of China and the people of Zimbabwe, the businesses of China and the businesses of Zimbabwe. We have to not only develop an attitude towards China that's xenophobic, and we also don't need to be xenomaniac. China has a lot to teach. There are many brilliant things that if you see what the Chinese have been able to do for themselves to lift the largest group of people in their country out of poverty. There are certain practices that Chinese businesses operating in Africa engage in that they would never be allowed to do in China. Building the people-to-people linkages is as essential as building the China watch that begins to pronounce itself on the excesses of some of these companies. All companies have shareholders, and you will discover that most companies that are from China, from the United Kingdom, from Europe, from America, that operate in our territories, they may be the same companies in different countries. So a unity of African citizens who are dealing with the malpractices of the same companies so that there's an amplification of voice that's transnational. An engagement with the Chinese Communist Party. I think that there's an old tradition built by the West where you don't engage people that you differ with. I think that it is absolutely essential. We must never be understood to say we don't want China to be involved in the development of Africa or in investment in Africa. I think that we want China to be a responsible investor in Africa and a true partner. And we don't want China to be linked purely to the interest of dictators and to means and forms and ways that are totally unaccountable. And in this regard, I will not caricature and say because China's own political system is considered fairly close, because even open Western systems produce some of the most pernicious environmental exploitation. Right? Some of the companies we complain about in the Congo and in Zambia were Australian or European or Canadian. So my sense is that let's not engage in any of the regime typology type things. Let's actually say what's a pathway to engaging for transformation. Number one, we need to deal with our own local autocrats and kleptocrats. And we have the means and the mechanisms. I see some of our members on this platform trying to do it in parliament. I see some trying to do it in the media and civil society. But beyond just backing at a moving bus, we also need this strategic engagement within the multilateral system, with SADC on the same matter, but engagement with the Chinese. The China-Africa Forum is going to FOCAC, is going to happen in Dakar in September this year. In October this year. The dates have not yet been set. And this is about time. Those citizens on this platform prepared themselves, started to convene platforms to discuss China-Africa, and in particular with a focus on Southern Africa. Reach out to some of their colleagues in Zambia and elsewhere, and have a very robust conversation that's not xenophobic and that's not xenomaniac, but a conversation that looks at evidence and says, this is what China could contribute to positively. This is what China is contributing to positively. This is what's negative with Chinese investment, and these are the examples and the evidence, and demanding some form of change and engagement with those that are responsible. I think ultimately it's the psychosis in our leadership that we see power as ownership of a country. So Chinuchedu is not just about a political party. It's not about the right to govern because one fought in the War of Liberation. It's actually about a much more sinister, the privatization of a country, the creation of Zimbabwe Inc., the privatization of our country, our destiny, and our future. And this is why, whether you're in ZANU-PF, in MDC, in civil society, or any other of the opposition political parties, you should contest this not as a political party problem, but as an intergenerational question, as a sovereignty issue. Because sometimes we tend to bandy this into political party pigeonholes. I think it's useful for us to take it out of the political party pigeonhole. It's not every ZANU-PF supporter who's benefiting from this, that's happy with what's happening with the sort of atrocious investment practices and treatment of workers. So let's reach out across the political divide as citizens of goodwill. Let's say any investor that comes to our country must contribute to this, and this is what we deem as benefit. Any politician who facilitates investment that does not achieve this is therefore against the will of the people, and they'll be sanctioned through the vote and other means. Okay, I'm going to do just a few takes on China, Africa, but let me start with China, because let me not assume everybody knows. So basically, if you look at the history of China's development, they had their first 5-year plan from 1953 to 1957, which was a new economic order modeled on the Soviet Union example. And it emphasized the development of capital-intensive heavy industry. And then they had what they called the Great Leap Forward, which was between 1958 and 1960. which was the breakaway from the Soviet model and the introduction of a new program aimed at rapidly raising industrial and agricultural production. And then, as you know, they had the Cultural Revolution, which was 1966 to 1976, the pursuit by Mao Zedong of an own development strategy of self-reliant economy and political struggle. And then post-1978, of course, China went through the economic reforms, which were aimed at moving the economy from a planned economy to one that is somewhat heterodox, with a bit of market orientation. If you're thinking of China's development model, you had a socialist planned economy, government planning as the basic means of allocating resources. There were production quotas, which were aimed at quantity rather than quality. They sought to suppress consumption in order to increase savings. They also invested in the heavy industries that sought to be more self-reliant and uninvolved in foreign economic relations. Actually, China was inward looking at the time. And then, of course, the result was the overuse of industrial equipment. They had shortages in supply and production and consumption of goods. And then the economy became unstable. And then, of course, they moved to a socialist market economy, which was market as a basic means of allocating resources. State controls were retained at the macroeconomic level. There were economic structural reforms. And then the result of that period was that competition, they established diversified ownership. There was a little bit of more efficient profit maximization. It was more open. They involved foreign economic relations. They were involved in them, and then the fast and stable economic growth was experienced. And then what's interesting is the Chinese economic reforms, right? There are 5 components of the Chinese economic reforms that are worth noting. The first is the rural reform. China had a largely rural population, so they sought to increase agricultural production and rural income. And then, of course, China created some form of open door policy, which was meant to turn around from an inward-looking, self-reliant economy to one that participated in the world economy, in foreign trade, in foreign direct investment, and special economic zones. Then China, in the age of economic reforms, also went through industrial reform, which was focused on enterprise reform and price reform, because there were distortions in that area. And China also undertook financial reform. So companies responsible for financial performance and borrowing money from banks, raising capital at the stock market. So this financial reform enabled a little bit more dynamism in the economy. But China realized, as most of our countries have over the last 60 years and some 40 years, that state-owned enterprises needed to be reformed. Reform the ownership, restructure, so that they don't become a drain on the economy. If you compare the two models that I talked about, the China socialist market economy and the planned socialist economy, you can see in terms of its impact on Chinese GDP. You are comparing two periods, in essence, 1952 to 1977 and 1977 to 1998. It's a huge leap forward, if you like. So China's outward posture is informed by the new challenges that China faced. The first were the 3 transitions, and in particular, China suffered a challenge related to population and environmental pressures. So if you've been to Beijing, you will know that you need a pass, a permit. So not everybody just can come and settle in Beijing. So you have people who work in some of the major centers who are from other provinces who get permits for temporary residence, and these unique population and environmental pressures are actually interesting. And then, of course, there's a question of employment insecurity. And China had a massive problem, a growing challenge of inequality and poverty. And then, of course, macroeconomic instability that stemmed from incomplete reforms. So reforms come in stages, and for China, they had some of these challenges, right? And so when they moved from a planned economy to a market-based one, and from a rural agricultural society to an urban industrial one, and from a non-WTO nation to a WTO nation, China faced unique transition problems, right? Because their population to environmental pressures were huge, large in number, 1.2 billion, and the growth rate was low, relatively speaking. It was at 1%. Yet urbanization was high, at around 30%. You had a large number of floating population, which is 100 million, And employment security, urban unemployment was growing. It was massive. If you look at the figures, 1978 to 1997, you would understand what I'm talking about. And if you look at per capita income and so on and so forth, China had a huge problem within the raw sector. So it needed more policy reforms, and these were the spread of market forces needed to be encouraged. Government needed to be restructured so that it's able to serve the growing market. So it needed to build the legal, social, physical, and institutional infrastructure. And then China also needed to technically prepare itself for the integration within the world economy, especially its participation in the WTO. So economic prosperity that varies substantially across the world, where you have countries that are richer than others, and economic growth rates that also vary relative to the position of a country and change over time. If you relate this to the standard of living, the standard of living is determined largely by the productivity of the economy. And the productivity of the economy depends on four determinants: physical capital, human capital, natural resource, and technological knowledge. So that's the point I was trying to make earlier, that if the standard of living of Zimbabweans, of Africans, in their relationship with the external world is dependent on economic productivity, and that productivity has four determinants, largely, there may be others: physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge. The question is, what are we investing in that? So for China, the policies of government that were key to influence the economy's growth was encouraging saving and investment, encouraging investment from abroad, but fostering education, and doing something about the question of property rights and political stability, allowing some free trade, controlling population growth, promoting research and development in new technology. And they understood that the accumulation of capital is subject to diminishing returns. So the more capital an economy has, the less additional output the economy gets from an extra unit of capital. So higher saving would lead to higher growth for a period of time, but growth eventually slows down as the economy approaches a higher level of capital productivity and income. So the return to capital is especially high in poor countries. So hence, you have to understand why our countries are attractive. So China's relationship with Africa was in this China-Africa, so 2000 to date. If you think about what China-Africa Forum was about, it started with this ministerial conference in Beijing in October 2000. And on the basis that Chinese countries and African countries had many exchanges in various fields, and they needed close cooperation, and they'd done so in many international forums, and that the underlying basis of the China-Africa Partnership, the FOCAC, was equality and mutual benefit, mutual accountability, emphasis on practical results, pursuit of common progress, amicable settlement of difference. So the priorities, if you conflate them, 2000 to 2018 FOCAC were on investment, joint ventures, engineering and infrastructure, financial cooperation, STEM applied research, medical care and public health, education and human resource development, environmental management and biodiversity, and China added peace and security to that. Because Africa was attractive to China. Think about where we were in 2000 going forward. 5% annual GDP growth in a good number of African countries. And the ADB and others had noted that 5 African countries enjoyed growth over a period of 10 years of about 7%, and 15 countries of about 5%, and 27 countries were above 2% growth. So Chinese FDI in Africa jumped from 9 billion in 2000 to 52 billion by 2011. And this was huge. So some people may ask, what was China seeing in Africa? So the growth rates recorded by certain African economies, the renewed Euro-American economic and political interest in Africa were actually triggered by China. So this newfound interest, so you had The Economist saying in 2010, in 2000, Africa was a hopeless continent, and by 2011, the same economist was saying Africa was rising. This is because of China and other emerging powers, so China, India, Brazil, and etc. So Africa had several opportunities, which meant new markets in which to sell their goods, alternative sources of finance and assistance. That's what Africa was seeing in China. Increased ability to lower Africa's dependence on traditional partners such as Europe and US, who are now imposing policy conditions on governance, on rights, and etc. And reducing the focus on the old relations of ex-colonial powers and the US, as well as dependence on aid, essentially. And then, of course, Africa saw the opportunity to leverage new partnerships in order to diversify their economies with a significant increase in trade. China was opening that possibility, foreign direct investment, and China was actually offering new debt. And so if you look at projections of the world economy up to 2050, it's clear China will be the world's largest economy, or is already. And that the world is changing, actually, if you put it in the context of emerging powers, add South Korea to those, and etc., and etc. So, in essence, if you look at non-OECD trade, the most prominent South-South partners in Africa are China, India, Iran, Korea, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. And if you just look at trade with Africa, China is 42% plus, India 14%, Korea 5.2%, Brazil 5.1%, Turkey 6.5%. So China has essentially replaced the US as Africa's main bilateral trading partner. And this gap continues to grow. And 25% of African trade with non-traditional partners is with countries outside the core 5. And these countries are China, Brazil, India, Turkey that I mentioned. And these countries are active in Africa, and they're not being paid attention to, right? Add to that Thailand, Russia, UAE, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Argentina, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. Undoubtedly, therefore, Africa is diversifying its dependence on trade. Why am I saying all this in order to answer a simple China question that you asked? It's because for us to go through the stages of reform that I've referred to, that like the Chinese reform, we have to ask the question, does Africa want its relationship with China and the other emerging powers to be qualitatively different from the relationship we had with the West? And if so, how do we make that qualitatively different? Right? Someone put it this way, that the question on the minds of most Africans is it better to be exploited by a Chinese, a Saudi, an Indian, or a Brazilian capitalist rather than a British or American one? if exploitation is exploitation, so what do we do to deal with this? So components that perhaps we have to be careful about in thinking about what is our cultural revolution, what's our industrial revolution, our agricultural revolution. If you just look at 2014 figures, for example, there was a component that Africa did not fully negotiate with China. It's the number of Chinese laborers that came with Chinese foreign direct investment. If I give you the top figures for 2014, these are much higher for now. If you take Algeria, 71,542 Chinese workers. Angola, 50,231. Right? If you take Ethiopia, 14,078, most of them doing infrastructure. Small countries such as Botswana was sitting at 1,458. Right? Zambia already had 7,489 Chinese workers in the country. And that may seem minuscule if you compare this to the amount of money that Zambia was getting. But it's huge in terms of determining what happened. And then, of course, there's the issue of debt. So the most issue, so that I don't contradict what I said earlier, is that I'm saying that China and the other non-Western partners offer us the following: products, capital goods, technology, know-how and expertise, development experience. And they also bring new ways of doing things which question previous assumptions. We share history with them. We are able to access diverse forms of development and investment finance and capital reserves. They also uphold a version of the developmental state model, which is what actually I think might suit us. And there are lessons to learn from them. They have mastered manufacturing and innovation, resulting in a global price competition. This is good for consumers, but not necessarily good for African manufacturers who remain not globally competitive. So one of the ways is to address global competitiveness as we engage. And then, of course, they've helped us to expand infrastructure, but this is driven largely by the Asian-induced boom in commodity prices. But the African imports of food and non-food items will threaten viability of our domestic market. So for us to be able to have an agricultural revolution, building regional agricultural value chains becomes important. So that's part of what I said. So that I keep this short, I've already been too long, is that part of the dividend from engaging China and the other non-Western partners is the technological transfer and cooperation that would come with these ties, and which could arguably alter Africa's economic governance landscape. So we move from the traditional post-colonial North-South relations towards a more diverse, more business-centric set of partnerships. It's promoted new sorts of competition of interest from the West. The scramble for Africa, the changes in the terms of economic partnership agreements, including the US AGOA, a diverse spectrum of relations is potentially good for us as Africa. But because of the points you raised earlier about how we're not governing our natural resources, not resolving the issue of ownership, management, and control of natural resources, how our governments are not channeling the revenues that we get from natural resources to high return infrastructure investments, to social service provisioning and human capital development, how we're not implementing common visions, and therefore we tend to still grow enclave economies, how we continue to import food, seed, and fertilizer instead of producing nitrates and other inputs that we need to produce our own fertilizers. And how we're not actually strengthening economic diversification and introducing mechanisms to help local manufacturers, including the local procurement policies. Where we have them, they are hijacked. So what's particularly important for us to reach the stages that you suggested of similar to what China did is actually what is sovereignty in economic terms. I hope in that long answer I've been able to say to you, there are lessons from China, there are opportunities from dealing with China and the other emerging powers, but there's a need for economic sovereignty, self-belief, self-confidence. There's a need almost for some form of protectionism that ensures that we don't end up displacing the local entrepreneur and producer and making the cost of production locally so expensive that it becomes pointless for the local industrialist. And this will include us addressing the energy question. If we don't address the energy question, the technology question, and I've already said research and development question, we will not be able to have an agricultural revolution, let alone an industrial revolution or an economic transformation. In part because my own suspicion is that we are not reasoning through the link between upward, sideward, and downward linkages between human capital development, infrastructure, including micro infrastructure, rural enterprise development, and the other aspects that enable a transformation that's truly revolutionary. And on the basis of culture, I think that our imagination of what is a cultural revolution is muted by our poor imagination. So I would say that I like what this platform is doing. Let's have these debates. There are people who are more knowledgeable than I am about how to transact, to engender a cultural revolution. So I will not claim to be an expert, but I hope I've shared my understanding of China, and that my encouragement is let's not engage in xenophobia, the fear of China, or sinomania, this total adoration of China. China is a state, a country with its own strategic national self-interest, and we also have our national and continental strategic interests, and we must find middle ground in dealing with each other and hold each other accountable, people to people, and ensure that in that relationship we don't reproduce the sort of imperial periphery relationships, so that China doesn't become the new imperial power and own our economies, own our futures through debt and other mechanisms, and own our assets as did the Europeans. Thank you. It's a fair point. There was something called the Botswana Declaration on Natural Resource Governance, where a couple of African heads of state actually said that if we are not yet clear and knowledgeable about what to do with them, let's leave them in the soil until such a time that we are clear and have knowledge of what they are, how they can develop us, and what we can do to beneficiate them so that they create opportunities for our people, including opportunities for employment and self-employment. My own sense is we owe an obligation to the current generation of the living to address the vagaries of poverty and inequality, but we owe a greater obligation to future generations, because the actions we take today can endanger the future of our children and our children's children. And I'm glad that this particular conversation is with experts who are mindful of the intergenerational equity questions. We must bequeath to the next generations a better version of Africa, of Zimbabwe, and indeed of the world than we inherited from our ancestors. And that we have this obligation in part because we know a lot more than the generations before. We have a lot more access to information, are better able to analyze certain things. And we know that the benefits are not just for us and the here and now. The benefits are for the future. China has a 50-year plan for Africa. Not having a 50-year plan for China, ourselves as Africa, and for India and for the rest of the world, never mind for ourselves, for Zimbabwe, places us in a position where we tend to make off-the-cuff, ad hoc decisions about issues that have fundamental intergenerational impact. You know, President Mbeki once shared a story about how they were invited to China, and the invitation was not to discuss corruption in government, but corruption in the ruling parties, and how to share experiences on how they were dealing with corruption within ruling parties. The view of the Chinese then was that if you don't stem corruption in governing parties, it's difficult to stem it anywhere else. I agree with you totally that this is the same problem we had with Western companies. Western companies were ethical, accountable, including environmentally within their countries. If you remember during the Obama years, how there was an oil spill for which I think it was BP was made to pay huge amounts of money. These same companies are not asked by our governments or anywhere in the developing world to pay similar amounts for the oil spills, the environmental degradation, the air pollution that they cause. There's always been this binary between what multinational corporations and transnational corporations do in their countries of domicile or do in the developed Western world and also in the Eastern and Middle Eastern world, and what they do when they go outside to invest. And this includes, you remember the fine that was levied on Ericsson's related to bribes by their own government in Sweden. I think in my earlier presentation I said when Nkrumah said seek ye first the political kingdom, he was indicating that until we get governance right, until we get politics right, it doesn't matter how we get policies right, we will never get to that stage where we're able to implement policies, whether they are foreign direct investment policies, aid policies, trade policies, in a manner that will be beneficial to our countries. You're absolutely right. The conduct of Chinese firms, and I must be clear, it's not all Chinese firms, but the ones that we see most in the media, we experience a lot more in the extractive sector, leaves a lot to be desired. And it is a far cry from what they would be able to do and get away with within China. So I think this is hence my clarion call that we need a structured engagement and framework of accountability, mutual accountability in the China-Africa relations. And I'm hoping that people like yourselves will engage the 9th FOCAC that's due to take place in October in Dakar, or at least mount national, sub-regional platforms to discuss what the framework of China-Africa cooperation should be going forward. What is the framework of accountability for Chinese investors within Africa? And generally, what is that framework of relationship that captures what was intended when FOCAC was established in 2000? My own cry, my own plea to everybody is China-Africa is here to stay. India-Africa is here to stay. Brazil-Africa is here to stay. Turkey-Africa, Europe-Africa, US-Africa. It's about time that we got our parliamentarians literate on what shapes these international economic relations. It's about time we got our citizens literate on issues financial, on issues trade, on issues economic. And to think about these terms in terms of the rights, the obligation, the responsibilities, and the accountabilities that the different players have, and ensuring that we don't end up with a situation where citizens think when the state delivers something to them, it's a gift they must be grateful for, when what is being used are taxes that are taken from workers. And for us to have that cultural shift, political shift, mindset shift, it also means that we need more organic intellectuals who go breaking these things down. The Chinese are not going to be any more responsible, any more accountable, unless if they're held accountable. The people are not going to feel they have the right to hold them accountable unless if we do conscientization, we do mobilization, we do organization. So my own plea is, let's not start from a hostility that says, because you are China, you are ultimately evil. No, let's start from a point that says there are international, regional, national obligations that any corporate or individual investor must meet and abide by. We're not banana republics. We are people who are as proud of their present and past as we are of our future. And our interaction with you must assure and guarantee our futures, and not necessarily only yours in an extractive way. No, I think that it's useful for you to understand the view. I challenge the notion that only STEM. So if you listen to all the audios, I accept that STEM is central. And that's why I kept on repeating the value of research and development, of innovation. What I have challenged is the belief that only STEM, exclusively STEM. I think that what I am saying in very simple terms, you need to make an equitable set of investments in STEM as well as non-STEM areas so that you have holistic development. Because the opportunities for employment, for self-employment, for innovation, for wealth creation are in STEM areas as well as non-STEM areas. So that's a simple idea. So I hope you've understood what is being challenged is the single bullet, the magical bullet approach. Before we were told agriculture was everything. So we all just, everything was agriculture. And then we were told financial service liberalization and deregulation was everything. What we've learned is that holistic development is creating the ecosystem of transformation. So if you strip away everything that I've said, and you look at how I've biographically tried to go through the pillars of opportunity, is my sense is that you build opportunities based on where your population is. You build opportunities based on where global and regional opportunities are. And in doing so, you create an ecosystem of transformation. That's why within economies we talk about diversification. And diversification has an industrial angle, it has a non-industrial angle. Diversification, there are economies that have grown just by growing services. But that growth has been affected, especially when the service economies are hit by pandemic, by other things. So please, when I refer to sideward, downward, upward linkages, it's an acknowledgement that science, technology, engineering, and maths are important. But implicit in my presentation is a view that says that they are not the only thing you need to develop, right? So you don't end up with a skew. Our previous skew was that we developed the theoretical basis. We forgot totally about vocational training because vocational training, when it was seen as what the failed students do, the ones that don't go to A level, that don't. But we've realized now that that was a mistake. And part of our industrial model must re-emphasize vocational training, the TVETs, the technical colleges, and etc. And we also realize that a society, China itself, in developing its outreach into the world, one of the things it establishes, most people focus on Chinese industries, is what are called Confucius Institutes, which are Chinese cultural projection into the rest of the world. Amilcar Cabral says every revolution is first and foremost a cultural revolution, meaning that you have to marry the narrative, the myth making. Americans did it through Hollywood, got us all to believe that they were the land, the home of the brave and the land of the free, so that we ignored the poverty amongst the Native Americans and persons of color. So culture is as important a component of growing and driving self-belief. Narrative is important. So if you marry the two ideas, I'm saying STEM is very important, but STEM is not everything. It will be idiotic for you to say only culture is everything or only STEM is everything. You have to look at all components as part of a continuum of creating an ecosystem of transformation.